right. Welcome in, everyone. We're going to give it just a few more seconds for folks to trickle in. As you come in, please introduce yourself with your name, organization, and location using the chat. Cool. I see people are starting to post. So welcome all to the Power of the Purse, understanding the federal budget process and how it shapes policy. Again, as you join in, please introduce yourself with your name, organization, and location using the chat. I'm Ali Rahimi, the National Grassroots Manager for Voices for Healthy Kids. For those of you unfamiliar with Voices for Healthy Kids, we are an initiative of the American Heart Association that works to pass equitable policies that make the places kids live, learn, and play healthier. Whether you're a seasoned advocate or new to the game, better understanding the federal budget process is important for all of us as we look to influence policy to make our communities healthier. So we're glad you're here. Before we get started, I do have some housekeeping items. First of all, today's call is being recorded. We'll make sure to share the recording, slides, and any tools or resources that we reference after the call. If you need assistance during the call, please message tech support in the chat. We will have a Q&A session at the end, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat box as they come up during the session so that we can address them. If we don't get to all of the questions or don't have the answer to any of your questions, we'll be sure to follow up after the call. We ask that you please keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking to allow others to best hear. Closed captioning is available during this meeting, and you can enable that option in the Zoom bar. At the end of the session, we'll share a brief survey that should take just a couple of minutes to complete. We'll even try to end the call 2 minutes early so that you have time to do so. We really do take your feedback seriously, and it will help make our future offerings better. We ask that all participants have respect and allow grace for one another today. Please experience this training how you learn best and let me know if there's anything I need to know. And again, if you haven't already done so, please introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, organization, and location. Welcome to all. And now for the main event. I have the pleasure of introducing Emily Halubowicz, the National Senior Vice President for Federal Advocacy at the American Heart Association. Emily joined the Heart Association in 2019 with more than 20 years of experience in health and fiscal policy, government relations, strategic communications, and coalition management. She is frequently sought out by the media for her expertise on public health and fiscal policy, serves as a lecturer in health policy and management at the George Washington University, and is called upon by national organizations to lecture on the policy environment and best practices in strategic communications and advocacy. Previously, Emily was a senior vice president at CRD Associates, where she worked with several clients in the public health community, including the Coalition for Health Funding as its executive director. Prior to CRD Associates, Emily was the director of government relations for Academy Health and a senior health policy analyst with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Welcome, Emily. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ali, for having me here today. It's so great to be with Voices for Healthy Kids in your community to talk more about the federal budget process. And I'm going to call on Joshua to help me advance my slides. Thank you in advance. And I probably at the start, in reflection, as you were introducing me, Ali, I should have put process in quotes. And I think that will become clear as I go through my presentation. But this is such a timely conversation as we are right in the middle of the appropriations and budget season right now here in Washington, D.C. So hopefully today I'll be able to share some insights, not just on the process, but then some of the political and policy dynamics that are unique to this year. So next slide, please. So just a quick overview of what we'll cover today. So as Ali noted, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just grounding ourselves in the history of Congress's role in the power of the purse. I will spend the bulk of my time talking about how the process is supposed to work, but then I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about how the process really works, or depending on your perspective, doesn't work. And so next slide, please. So we'll dive right in. So really, the federal budget and appropriations process is grounded really in the history of our nation. And as you think about how our government is designed and how we spend money as a federal government and who has authority over that money, it really is rooted in the Federalist Papers and really leading up to our Federalist system of the separation of powers. And so in the US Constitution, here you see Article 1, Section 9. This is the section that grants Congress the power of the purse. That is, it is up to Congress to determine how much money will be spent every year and on what, and really up to the executive branch to then carry out those directions from Congress. So we have a little saying here in Washington, D.C. to help us remember and clarify kind of who's in charge of the money. And that is the president proposes spending, but Congress disposes of the spending. So next slide, please. In the budget and appropriations process, we really have our own language. And so part of what I'll do today is talk through some of the key terms and what they mean as they relate to federal spending and the process itself. But I'd also note, I love giving this talk because I was a student of public policy, did a master's in public policy, and I'd say 99% of our coursework is on what we call authorizing legislation. That is to establish new things. So little time is spent on talking about appropriations legislation, which is what we'll focus on today. And more specifically, how to really leverage the appropriations process to drive policy. And so we'll talk more about that. But we do have our own terms here in Washington, D.C. relative to the federal budget. And the two big ones are this, and they relate to the categories of spending. We have discretionary or indirect spending, and then mandatory or direct spending. I personally, I'm biased, obviously, as an advocate for public health and one who appreciates the role of government in protecting the public's health. I hate the term discretionary because I think when people think of discretionary, it really implies these things don't matter. But really, it's meant to refer to the fact that this funding is allocated at and appropriated at the discretion of Congress. So every year, and we'll talk more about the cycle, but it's really up to Congress to decide how much to spend on these programs, if anything at all, and what programs will receive that funding. There are 12 appropriations bills that must pass every year to continue operations of the federal government. We'll talk about what happens when that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen fairly frequently. But that really is where I'm going to focus today, is on that discretionary side of the ledger and the discretionary appropriations process. The other big chunk of federal funding is considered mandatory, and this term, or direct, and it's really to refer to the programs that are established by Congress under authorizing legislation. And the funding just really flows from the Treasury, depending on the categories, the statutory limitations around expiration dates, and that really flows. Until that underlying statute is changed, the money just flows. The big categories of mandatory spending that probably many of the folks on this call are familiar with are the entitlements. So Medicare, Social Security. Another considered mandatory funding stream is the interest on our national debt. That's also considered mandatory spending. And as our debt increases, that amount of interest to be paid also increases. But again, the bottom line here is to really change the trajectory of that mandatory spending, you must change those eligibility rules. And depending on the authorization date or the expiration date of that legislation, that really would be the only trigger to try to change that spending. So when we think about, for example, Medicare spending, we, to really really change that spending, you need to change the eligibility rules. So for example, I know there are a lot of protests in France right now for changing the eligibility age for retirement. changing the eligibility age, changing when and what people are eligible for those programs. Those are how we would make legislative changes on the mandatory side of the ledger. So next slide, please. And I've kind of touched on this already. So there are these two types of legislation. You have authorizing legislation and appropriating legislation or appropriations legislation. And so authorizing legislation really just authorizes the appropriation of funds to do things. So to create new agencies, to create new programs, to create new authorities and government functions. There is often then, I think I've been doing this long enough, you realize pretty quickly, there's very little you can do in Washington without spending money on something. And so that's where appropriations legislation comes into play. So appropriations legislation, this is the fancy terminology, confers budget authority on agencies to incur obligations. Essentially, it's deciding which agencies and programs have how much to spend and on what they should be spending it. So as an advocate, when we think about laws and how to impact laws, we often, again, I think it's partly because this is what we're taught in school, we go directly to authorizing legislation. We need an authorizing bill to do this. And that's fine. I think what you learn pretty quickly, though, is maybe not. Maybe you don't need authorizing legislation. Depending on the authorities of existing agencies and programs, and you find they tend to be generally pretty broad, there's actually a lot you can do by just going straight to the appropriations process and trying to move the dial in that way using appropriations legislation. Next slide. And so again, building on that concept, there really is no requirement in the Constitution or in our existing laws that an appropriation needs to be preceded by an authorization. So again, looking at existing statutes, looking at the authorities of existing agencies, you can use the appropriations process to move your policy agenda forward. As long as it's being funded, that program can happen. Now, there are rules about authorizing on appropriations bills, and that can be a little bit squishy. You can't create whole new things just doing with new authorities. You can't create a new agency in theory without breaking some rules or waiving some rules. But generally, you can't do that. But again, within existing authorities of existing agencies and programs, you'll find that there's a lot of flexibility there. So when I was a consultant, working with different clients and talking about their advocacy goals, my first question would always be, does this agency already have the authority to do this? And if so, maybe we don't need an authorizing bill. Let's go straight to appropriations. I will say authorizing bills can be helpful. We had an example last year. American Heart Association led advocacy on the Carroll Act, which authorized funding for the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention around valvular research and education and data collection on sudden cardiac arrest. We didn't need authority to do any of those things. The agencies could have already done that under their existing authority. And in fact, they have been doing it until the era of austerity and budget cuts and sequestration happened in 2011, and those programs went away. But what it did was it helped build some bipartisan momentum, and it really helped galvanize support for eventually that appropriation, which we were able to secure appropriations funding for those authorizations in the same year. That's pretty unusual, but we knew starting out, we needed to get started early, thinking this legislation was probably going to pass and these programs would be authorized. We wanted to get out in front of that and start lobbying to ensure there were funds appropriated so that when they all came together at the end of the year, the magic happened. As I mentioned, most authorizations are meaningless without an appropriation. I think the Affordable Care Act is a great example of this. One example that comes to mind is a healthcare workforce commission that was to be appointed. It was never funded. And so that commission never met because they didn't have any budget to fly people to meet. They didn't have any budget to hire staff to staff that group. And there were actually, I think, more than 100 examples of legislation that was part of the Affordable Care Act and created new things that was never funded. And that was actually one of the strategies around the repeal and replace movement. I recall a quote from Senator Orrin Hatch, actually, right after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, and something to the effect of that, if we can't repeal Obamacare wholesale, we will do so retail by death through 1,000 cuts. And so really leveraging the appropriations process was a way to blunt forward progress on the Affordable Care Act in all of its different titles and sections. This is also where, if you don't have an appropriation, where you have something called an unfunded mandate, we hear that term a lot. So it's basically legislation authorizing a lot of new things. And then if the appropriation never flows, the agency will say, well, gee, great, now I have this unfunded mandate. And so how am I supposed to do this work if I don't have funding to do it? An example that comes to mind for me is the Food Safety Modernization Act, where the FDA had a lot of new authorities to increase the safety of and improve the safety of our food supply. And unfortunately, those were not fully funded, and I believe still are not fully funded. So there's some examples of the tension between appropriations and authorizations. And something top of mind for me as we're hearing chatter about wanting legislation potentially among House Republicans that would authorize the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There's actually hasn't been an authorizing bill for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. One would argue that if Congress approves every year to appropriate funding for a program, that in and of itself is an authorization to spend the funding. So there's a sort of academic argument about, like, do you even need authorizations? But that's just a little bit more on how the interplay and interexchange there is between those two types of legislation. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to start getting into the meat on the quote unquote process. Again, this is extremely timely. You'll hear a lot about the president's budget request, or the PBR, that is submitted to Congress every year, that really is just simply a wish list. So I was joking with colleagues and talking about the president's budget request that was released on March 9th. You're going to hear a lot of the pundits talking about this is dead on arrival. And that's pretty much true, I'd say, across the board, regardless of who's in charge with Congress. Congress takes their power of the purse pretty seriously. And while they do take into account what the president includes in the president's budget request, they're kind of looking at it like, well, that's nice. But yeah, thanks for the input, but here's what we're going to do. But that's really what kicks off the budget and appropriations cycle. It then turns to Congress to get to work. And so Congress, in theory, every year should adopt a joint resolution that sets the overall top line for the year's spending for, in particular, discretionary appropriations, but also can set some targets around mandatory spending. You may recall last year, we heard a lot about budget reconciliation. Reconciliation is a budget process that allows for changes to policy only in areas of revenue, spending, and the debt limit that can essentially bypass the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. So it was through budget reconciliation that Congress was able to enact on a partisan basis last year things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the CARES Act earlier in the year. The budget resolution really sets that up and tees up that process and allows for that to happen, setting some targets for authorizing committees to work on and propose changes to advance those policy objectives. And essentially, that's an internal document, if you think about it. It is the budget resolution, if adopted, is not signed by the president. This is really Congress's roadmap on how they're going to tackle issues related to spending and revenue and the debt limit over the next fiscal year. Once you have a budget top line, in particular, that overall limit on discretionary spending, now the work turns to the appropriations committees. And so it is in the appropriations committees that the chairs will essentially set what we call 302B allocations, or the Bs, And the Bs are, if you think about it, just the slices of the pie. So the budget resolution is setting the size of the pie. It may be a 6-inch pie, it may be a 12-inch pie. And then it's up to the appropriations chairs to divvy up that pie across their 12 subcommittees. And then it's up to those subcommittees to determine within their jurisdiction, how are they going to spend that money within the programs, agencies, and activities in their committee's jurisdiction. As I mentioned earlier, these levels are set at the discretion of Congress every year. There are 12 of these appropriation spending bills. The one we pay the most attention to here at the Heart Association, there are two, is the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and Related Agencies bill, where we focus a lot on the appropriations for public health service agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services. We also spend a lot of time focused on the Agriculture, FDA and related agencies bill. That's where we find funding for the Food and Drug Administration, for USDA. We see a lot of funny business on policy in that bill I can talk more about. But it's really at the discretion of those subcommittees to determine how they want to divvy up their funding. The other type of appropriations bill is a supplemental bill. And so if you think about a budget, I think Congress, people, do their best to plan and to prepare a budget for, a foreseeable period of time, but things happen. Wildfires happen, wars happen, public health emergencies happen, like COVID. And so in the event that there is an unusual circumstance that needs funding and Congress needs to respond to, you see things like emergency supplemental bills emerge. And so an emergency supplemental appropriations act is just that. It is essentially a bolus of one-time funding to address a specific need. Sometimes they move as standalone bills, sometimes they move as parts of other bills. But of course, most recently, all those COVID emergency supplemental spending bills you saw in 2020 are actually emergency appropriations legislation. Next slide, please. Okay, and so as I've alluded, you can really leverage appropriations legislation to affect not just funding levels, but also policy. And lawmakers do this. I think, one kind of really interesting factoid is that on average, a sort of substantive authorizing piece of legislation at the federal level can take 7 years. That's things that do things other than name post offices. So there are examples of things that have taken, actually are below that average and have moved pretty quickly. You think about healthcare reform, it's something that arguably took 30 years between major enactment of Medicare in 1965 to where we landed with the Affordable Care Act. But essentially, the appropriation cycle happens every year. It might not take 12 months, might take longer, but it's something that has to happen every year. And so I think policymakers and advocates look at appropriations legislation through that lens of like, okay, well, here's a vehicle that's moving. What can we do through this appropriations legislation to move our policy agenda forward? And there are several ways to do that. Obviously, by providing funding or defunding programs is a way to impact policy. Hopefully, for the things we like, we're seeing increases in funding. But of course, cutting funding is, in many instances, clearly has an effect on policy and people, and is something that, especially right now, as we are awaiting a House budget resolution, which we expect to be fairly bleak. Happy to talk more about that in our discussion and what that means. But if you think about a budget and an appropriations bill as part of a budget, it truly is a statement of priorities. And so when we look at the balance of federal spending, where about 2/3 of spending is on the mandatory side of the ledger, about 1/3 is on the discretionary side of the ledger. These are programs that relate to public health, scientific research, education, housing, transportation, environment. It's Actually, Veterans Affairs is on the discretionary side of the ledger, and Veterans Healthcare, Indian Health Service. Everything that's not defense is called non-defense discretionary. Defense makes up about half of that third of discretionary spending. The other half is on all the other stuff that the federal government does that is in the Pentagon and is in entitlements. And so when we're looking at cuts to those programs, when you start exempting things, there's not a lot you can preserve. It's hard to protect or not cut things when you're saying, we want to cut spending by 20%, but we're not going to cut defense and we're not going to cut entitlements. Well, that doesn't leave much to pick from. So what it means is really, really deep cuts in those domestic programs that appropriators are providing funding for every year. So that's some of what we're anticipating this year. More to come. We might want a follow-up webinar on that. But it is a statement of priorities. The fact that we spend half of discretionary spending on our military, more than most other industrial nations combined, well, that tells you where our priorities are. It's not a statement of judgment, but it's a fact that tells you about how we prioritize. And so where people increase and where people want to cut will tell you a lot about what lawmakers prioritize. Thanks, Linda. I am judging. Okay, maybe I'm judging too a little bit, but that's an area. So anytime you're squeezing that balloon or you're letting the air out of the balloon on the funding side, that has an impact on policy and people. The other thing lawmakers use appropriations bills to do, and it's pretty sneaky, and people on both sides of the aisle do this, and that is using appropriations legislation to enact what are called policy riders. And they're called riders because they essentially ride on appropriations bill, but they are typically on topics that if people were paying attention and you were trying to move through an authorizing bill, probably couldn't pass on a bipartisan basis, which you pretty much need now to move anything through Congress. And so you slip this language into appropriations legislation to block certain things from happening. So I think the most famous ones, or infamous, depending on where you sit, are things like the Dickey Amendment. So the Dickey Amendment was a ban that wasn't necessarily a ban, but kind of interpreted as a ban on federal funding for gun violence research. The other very well-known policy rider that has been around for decades is the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits the use of federal funding for abortions. So these slither their way into appropriations legislation. One that we're watching very closely is in this year's Ag and FDA appropriations bill is related to the proposed rulemaking around nutrition standards for school meals. And so what we might expect would be a policy rider in legislation submitted by those who don't like healthy school meals and don't like what the administration has proposed to say, no such sums shall be used to implement this rulemaking. So we're always mindful for that. So as an advocate in appropriations, and if you're thinking about how to leverage appropriations bills for policy change, you got to mind the funding, but you also have to keep an eye out for riders. Riders can be good too, and you can use riders to advance your agenda. Unfortunately, though, it feels like they're used more often for evil than good. The other thing I would highlight in a way to shape policy through appropriations legislation is through report language. And so you have your bill text. So there's an appropriations bill that typically often reads as, this much money is allocated for this agency or this program or this center within the agency. But you also have accompanying every appropriations bill a report. And the report sheds a little bit more light on the intent of Congress and provides more specific detail about within that agency or within that program, here's what we really want you to spend this money on. And here's how much, and sometimes here's how much money we're providing you to do that. And so it's really for discrete projects, discrete activities. It doesn't have to be related to a program. It could be, Congress wants the agency to provide a report to them on a topic within 60 days of enactment of the act. But it really is around directing the administration to do new activities. Sometimes funding is provided, sometimes it's not. The expectation is they do it without explicit new funding, unfunded mandate. It's also where you see these riders slip in. So we have riders like Dickey, which now has been stripped out of the appropriations legislation, but amendments like Hyde that are actually written into the bill text that have the force of law. In the report, you have the report language does not have the force of law. It's more guidance to the agency, but there's that saying, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. If Congress has given you direction as an agency in the report that they want you to do something with the money they've provided, you can bet they're going to be paying attention to that, and you better pay attention as an administration, or you'll be getting questions about that at one of the appropriations hearings. So next slide, please. And this is, I won't go in too much detail on this slide, because I think it somewhat speaks for itself, but this is the Schoolhouse Rock slide. This is the how the process is supposed to flow and the timing. It is, when you hear the term regular order, this is what folks are referring to as it relates to the budget and appropriations process. Technically, again, as I mentioned, the president's budget request should be released on the first Monday in February. That rarely happens. And then that kicks off the rest of the process, such as the adoption of a budget resolution, the 302B allocations, and the subcommittees marking up their bills, differences being ironed out in committee in the fall-ish, and then all to the president for signature by October 1st. And before I then talk about how the process really works, I will just say, I think Congress gets a lot of heat for not doing their job. I mean, I've been there too. This is literally like the one thing Congress has to do, according to the Constitution, is appropriations. And they don't do a great job at it, which I'll share more about. But when you think about this and you think about this process, and remember I said authorizing legislation for substantive bills that are really about policy change take on average 7 years. Each of these appropriations bills is thousands of pages in the accompanying report language. Then on top of that, there are 12 of them. They're moving through both chambers. They're not talking to each other while they're moving through both chambers. They don't come together until the fall to conference and work out a final bill that then must go back through the House and back through the Senate before going to the president. And they have to do that 12 times. So it is not a surprise that you see a breakdown in the process, and really in a 9-month time frame, really difficult to meet these timelines. This modern budget and appropriations process, just for fun fact, is outlined in the Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. More fun facts, it was actually the last piece of legislation that President Nixon signed. And this bill became about because President Nixon was impounding funds. And impounding is another fancy budget term for essentially not doing with the money what Congress wanted the president to do. So basically ignoring the appropriations legislation and saying, nice Congress, but this is actually how I'm going to spend the money. And you can't do that. And so that led to the Budget Impoundment Control Act. And some speculate that if it weren't the last bill that Nixon signed as he was leaving office after resigning, he probably would have vetoed it and it would have then become a thing. But nonetheless, that's how we ended up where we are today with this process that unfortunately is very unworkable. So next slide, please. Okay, so when I've teed up, this process really works as it should. And do we have a next slide? Joshua, where are we stuck? There we go. So then what do we do? Well, there are a couple things you can do. If you don't do anything, the government shuts down on October 1st, and that has happened in recent history. Unfortunately, and I'll discuss that more, it's happening more frequently than I think many people would like. But if we're being responsible, you would enact something called a continuing resolution, which is essentially an easy out for lawmakers when they haven't been able to finish their work on appropriations legislation, to essentially kick the can down for the road for a certain amount of time until they are able to complete their work. It funds the federal government, keeps the government running, again, for a finite period of time. It could be a full year. So maybe they just give up and they're like, this isn't going to work this year. We're not going to have a compromise. I'm not a betting person, but my spidey sense is telling me that's where this year is going to land. Is that we're not able to get to any agreement on anything. And so we'll see a year-long continuing resolution. So we can play this back next year and see if I was right. It could be a day. I mean, we've seen that happen where deal is reached at the last minute, but oh my God, we don't have time to move the legislation. So we're going to move a short-term continuing resolution over the weekend or literally for a day to just get things wrapped up and give us time to move this through the process. So it generally holds funding at current levels, so no change. So this is where a year-long resolution can be a good thing or a bad thing. You know, if you're looking at an environment where we are now, where we're facing deep cuts to discretionary programs, at least on the domestic side, in the House, maybe some marginal increases in the Senate. Well, a negotiated bill, the Senate isn't going to get everything they want. So you're looking at maybe a 3% increase in the Senate between a 25% cut in the House. Well, there's going to be some cut. There's going to be blood along the way. Some things are going to be left on the floor. And so maybe flat funding for everything is not bad. Or if it means we're able to keep out harmful policy riders, because there can be no new riders under a year-long continuing resolution, maybe that's a good thing. If you are hopeful for a big increase in your programs, you're not very happy because, again, your funding's held flat. It's certainly not a great or efficient way to run the government. There is an annual appropriations process for a reason. Lawmakers should be doing oversight of programs, and maybe there are things we shouldn't be funding anymore. And you would like to see that worked out through the appropriations process, but ultimately a CR kind of holds everything still. I have seen examples where a continuing resolution has been an across-the-board cut. So we're funding programs at current levels minus 5% or 2%. I have seen continuing resolutions where they pick sides. So they decide we're going to fund this at the House legislative levels or the Senate legislative levels, but most often it is just holding things steady and just kind of keeping the trains moving as they are. There is a phenomenon of bundling appropriations bills. So you can imagine October 1st comes and goes. Congress hasn't moved any appropriations bills. They've got 12 of them they got to figure out. And we're coming up on the end of the year and people want to leave for the holidays. And so like, okay, let's just put this all together. It is often happens in December. And when that happens, when you take all the appropriations bills and you stick them all together, and often other things slip in there too on the authorizing side, that's called an omnibus piece of legislation. Just in December, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 was an omnibus bill. There is another phenomenon called minibuses. And so it's not all the bills, but it's packaging different bills together to move them forward. And, you know, it's interesting to see the pairings sometimes. You're like, why would you put defense with labor HHS? That doesn't make any sense. Defense is one of those bills that tends to get a lot of support on the Republican side of the aisle. Labor, HHS, and education tends to be a little bit more controversial, tends to get more votes on the Democratic side of the aisle. So it actually is a marriage made in heaven, because what it does is Republicans don't want to vote against defense spending. Democrats don't want to vote against health and education spending. And so everyone holds their nose and they vote and the bill passes. So there's usually a strategy behind the mini buses. And in recent history, we saw what happens when the defense bill moves and others don't and tend to get left behind. So in the appropriations process, if you're putting buses together, not to mix my vehicle metaphors, but the defense bill tends to be the engine that drives that train going forward. And then more recently, we've seen this crumnibus which is only a term we could come up with here in Washington, which is really a combination of an omnibus for bills where you could reach agreement and a continuing resolution for the year for those on which you couldn't. And we have had a couple of those in recent history. So next slide. And this just depicts, the numbers are very, very tiny. So you'll have to kind of go with me on this. But this is a picture of the appropriations breakdown, if you will. And it's the length of lapsed appropriations. So the length of a continuing resolution measured in days. And so as you can see, we've had a continuing resolution for just about every year. In fact, every year, going back 20 years. In fact, as we talk about that regular order, with the exception of 1989, 1995, and 1997, there has been at least one continuing resolution enacted for every fiscal year since 1954. So the irregular order is actually more regular. More recently, I mentioned the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023, which was enacted in December 22. That was a 90-day CR. The year before that, we had 166 days of CR. That final appropriations legislation wasn't enacted through until March. You'll notice there's no bar for the labor HHS bill in 2019. I like to call that the best of times and the worst of times, depending on where you sit. It was the first time that the labor HHS appropriations bill had been funded on time in 22 years. And the reason is it was prepared with the defense bill. That was also the year that we had the longest government shutdown. So for any of those bills that weren't on that defense minibus train, they were unable to reach agreement on funding levels. And we had a 35-day government shutdown for most federal agencies, including FDA and the Indian Health Service. So again, best of times, worst of times, depending on which programs you're watching. We also saw in 2014 a 16-day shutdown. That was the infamous Affordable Care Act backlash, Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate filibustering around ACA funding that led to that shutdown. And in 2018, interestingly, we had a 2-day and then another 1-day shutdown. Democrats tried to play the like, we're going to hold fast and firm and we're going to shut down the government card. And it's not really in their nature. So they eventually were like, no, we don't like this. We're gonna do an appropriations bill. But you know, what's interesting to me about this chart is when you look at the bars and you see where we've had the longest shutdowns, probably won't surprise you, those coincide with election years. It also is interesting to me when we look at the years of shutdowns, and I've indicated those with an asterisk, they're happening more frequently. Before that shutdown in fiscal year 2019, the last shutdown was in the Bill Clinton era. You know, the Newt Gingrich, Bill Clinton showdown that I think lasted around 20 days. And so we see these shutdowns being more frequent, which for those of us who care about a functioning government is very concerning. Next slide, please. And so before we get to questions, I think my major takeaways, having been an appropriations lobbyist for more than 20 years, and every year I think I've seen it all and I'm proven wrong. This will be one of those years, I promise. I think for you as advocates to remember, the power of the purse is used to shape policy, full stop. I think I've made the case that the process is predictable in that it will be unpredictable every year. And really, as an advocate, working in federal appropriations, you just kind of have to be ready for everything and you have to be watching everything. So thank you, Ellie, for having me here today. I love seeing the little pop-ups in the comments as I was talking, but I'm hopeful we have some questions either about the process, strategy tactics on leveraging the process, or even just kind of where we are right now in the current environment and, you know, where I think things are headed.
That was great, Emily. Thank you. And we are taking questions now, so feel free to add them to the chat box, use the raise hand function or come off mute. Emily, we have one from LaDawn. What's the best way to find writers for a non-policy researcher?
A great question. Well, some of it is just being creative enough to think about diabolical ways that lawmakers will try to undermine the policies you care about. I think, at a starting point, any hot button topic, you got to be on the lookout for. So something that I'm anticipating this year, I mentioned the USDA school meal nutrition standards riders, something that we know because we've seen it before. A lot of times this is not creative stuff. Lawmakers tend to go back to the same playbook over and over. If at first you don't succeed, or maybe you did succeed and you want to double down. So kind of just thinking about what are people talking about right now? So something that I'm very mindful of, and my spidey sense is picking up just reading the news, frankly, newspapers, is all that's happening around language, the terms that we use. And I will quote Governor DeSantis from Florida, where woke goes to die in Florida, right? So there is, I think we can anticipate in the appropriations legislation, at least in the House, riders that, no such sum shall be used to fund the Office of Health Equity at HHS, or to prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion in, federal agencies, or, you can anticipate that there will be things around that. Similarly, I think on the other side of the aisle, hot button topics to watch out for, on areas where Democrats potentially would lean in on removing riders. So the Dickey Amendment was finally stripped after 2 decades from the appropriations legislation because of the epidemic of gun violence in schools. That's what really shook loose the ability to pull that rider out of the legislation. Rosa DeLauro, when she was chairing the Labor HHS subcommittee last year, made an effort to pull out the Hyde Amendment around abortion, especially in response to the Dobbs decision. So just kind of watching the news and what's bubbling up and what's getting attention is a good way to think, I wonder if they're going to try to use the appropriations process this year to do something about that. And so that's kind of where we go. And, all the documents are always posted online. So it's a great question. It is on the House Appropriations Committee has a website. The Senate Appropriations Committee has a website. They post everything. They post the bill text. They post the reports. And unfortunately, it's just not very sophisticated, but some of it's just like Control F. Do a Control F on the things you care about and see what they're saying about it in the language. Is probably for a non-registered lobbyist who does this every day is a good way to just get a sense of what's going on here in these bills. Hopefully that helps a little bit. It's a great question.
Thanks. And then I do want to see if we can get to Logan real quickly.
Yeah, hi Logan.
Hey, great presentation. That was really insightful. Thank you. I have a question about the major questions doctrine from West Virginia v. EPA. And you can, obviously, there's probably a lot to answer in this, but I think my opinion is, and I think a lot of people agree, Supreme Court seems to be really pulling back a lot of the agency power that was for decades the deference given to agencies for everything from big decisions to little decisions, but for spending on a lot of these things. And it seems that the Supreme Court has gone to the theory that unless it's explicitly stated in the legislation, you can't do it, agency. Are you seeing that fallout? West Virginia was really on a major question of economic significance for the economy, financial significance for the economy, but the spending is a big part of the deference that agencies get. Do you think, and have you heard much about where this is going? And are people in agencies worried?
Yeah, it's a great question, Logan. I don't know that I've seen it through the appropriations process, but I'm picking up that same vibe that you are, and I think as advocates, there are other cases we're watching now. It does seem like there is a trend to rein in, if you will, executive authority through this conservative Supreme Court. It's probably not altogether surprising given the composition, but other things. So for example, and maybe we need a webinar on this, if you are not paying attention to Braidwood v. Texas, which is a case coming up through Texas, related to the Affordable Care Act and in the provision of preventive services. 100 million, I just saw a study from, I think it was Kaiser, 100 million Americans with employer-sponsored coverage have taken advantage of the preventive services that are provided under the authority of the Affordable Care Act as approved by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. One of the arguments the plaintiffs are making is that the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force is non-constitutional because it was not appointed by the Senate and or the president. And so, we watch that EPA case and you can draw that line of like, okay, well, what does that then mean for how this will play out when this eventually gets to the Supreme Court? It's extremely concerning for those of us who care about prevention and public health. And so I think it's a great question of, do we begin to see this play out in the appropriations process? I think we will probably see some of that, especially through the riders, essentially blocking, the use of funds to implement things that members of Congress don't want the administration to do. We'll see more of that. It's, I wouldn't say a direct response to the EPA West Virginia case, but it is in that same vein, if that makes sense. Thank you for that question.
Thanks,
yes,
Emily.
These are the things that keep me up at night, Logan. So thanks for raising them.
Us too.
Well, thank you again, Emily, for joining us and sharing that informative insight on the budget process. We hope that you all got a great deal out of today's session and that you plan on joining us for future trainings. Before we break, there is a survey link in the chat as well as the QR code on your screen. I'm hopeful that you all will take the time to fill this out now, as the information you provide is critical in helping us deliver the best trainings possible. So thank you again for joining us today, and please reach out if we can be of any additional assistance.
Thank you all.